Hi everyone, let's continue our investigation into the historical King Arthur and the idea that he was actually the same as Athrwys, son of Meirig from southeast Wales. So in the previous two videos we've looked at the geography and the chronology and the power and the names of these two figures, and we've seen how these four elements match. But in this video we're going to look at their family members. Now this is a particularly interesting part, okay? This is my favorite bit, because if you can identify specific individuals who were said to have been specific family members of King Arthur, and you can identify them as those same specific family members of Athrwys, then that's about as good a confirmation as you could possibly get that Athrwys is the same as Arthur. So let's start with the most famous example among those who are familiar with the Athrwys theory, which is that Athrwys and Arthur are both said to have a sister called Anna. So we find this claim regarding King Arthur in the writings of Geoffrey of Monmouth. In his Historia Regum Britanniae, he explains that Arthur had a sister called Anna. Now, Geoffrey says that Anna married Lot of Lothian, a king from the north of Britain. But according to Welsh tradition, the sister of Arthur who married Lot of Lothian had a different name. So this suggests, if we accept that Arthur did have a sister called Anna, like Geoffrey claims, she wasn't actually the wife of that particular king. She may have married someone else. Geoffrey's account indicates that Arthur had more than one sister. So he may have simply got this name mixed up, because, like I said, Welsh tradition is clear that it wasn't Anna who married the king of Lothian. But anyway, the basic idea that he had a sister called Anna matches the fact that there's a tradition that Athrwys also had a sister called Anna. So one of the earliest of the hagiographies, the medieval lives of the saints, is the life of Saint Samson of Dol. In fact, it might even be the earliest, if I'm not mistaken. It dates to possibly as early as the 7th century. Now, according to this life, Samson was the son of a princess of Gwent called Anna, and also a man from Dyfed called Ammon. Now, the life unfortunately doesn't describe who their respective parents were, but according to tradition dating at least as early as the 18th century, Anna was the daughter of Meirig, and Ammon was the same as a figure seen elsewhere in other records called Annwn, the son of the Emperor of Brittany, also known as Buddoc of Brittany. So this is what later tradition says. Is this consistent with the earliest record, the life of Saint Samson? Well, according to the life of Saint Samson, the respective fathers of Anna and Ammon were high-ranking court officials of their respective kingdoms. They were said to be from noble and distinguished families. So that arguably is indeed consistent with later tradition. Now you might be thinking, well, hold on. Okay, Ammon was said to have been the same, according to later tradition, the same as Annwn, the son of the king of Brittany. But the life of Saint Samson says that Annwn, or rather Ammon, was a high-ranking court official from Dyfed, which is in southwest Wales, while Anna was said to have been the daughter of a high-ranking court official of the kingdom, not the daughter of the king of the kingdom. So how does that match her being the daughter of Meirig, king of southeast Wales? Well, when we look at other elements from Welsh tradition, we see how this does actually make a lot of sense. So regarding Ammon, he was said to have been from Dyfed. Yes, that's right. Whereas Annwn was a prince from Brittany. However, according to the life of Saint Odosius, in the early 6th century, a portion of the royal family of Brittany had fled to Dyfed. They had been exiled by someone. It doesn't say who, although it was probably Maxentius, king of Brittany. But in any case, Dyfed was said to have received these fugitives of the royal family from Brittany. And that was in the early 6th century. So that matches when Ammon would have been around, when he would have met and married Anna of Gwent. And logically, if the king of Dyfed received these royal family members, they would have been given prestigious positions, although they wouldn't have ruled the kingdom, but they would have been given prestigious positions logically. So that matches what the life of Saint Samson says about Ammon's father being from a noble and distinguished family and a high-ranking court official in that kingdom, Dyfed. And there's some very strong evidence for this when we look at the life of St. Paul of Leon. So in that life, we find a clear statement that Samson was the cousin of Judwal, the king of Brittany. So how could he have been the cousin of the king of Brittany? Well, Judwal was said to have been the son of the sister of Annun. In other words, Budic's daughter, Budic being the king of Brittany. So Judwal was said to have been her son. So if we identify Annun with Ammon, the father of Samson, then that would indeed make Samson and Judwal first cousins, like the life of St. Paul of Leon says. So there is good reason to accept the identification of Ammon with Annun, the son of Budic of Brittany. So how does this fit Anna being the daughter of the king of Southeast Wales? The king of Southeast Wales wouldn't be a high-ranking court official, he would be the king, and Meirig was the king of Southeast Wales. So you might think, well, that doesn't work. Well, all this would mean is that Anna got married to Ammon before Meirig was ruling as king. So in other words, while he was still a prince of the kingdom, while his father Tudrig was still ruling as king, still alive. So this fits the profile of Ammon's father, if we identify him as Budic, a powerful prince, but not ruling in his kingdom, but living and serving likely as a high-ranking court official of David. That fits Meirig being a prince and serving as a high-ranking court official in his kingdom while his father was still alive. Just like in Geraint and Enid, how Arthur's son is referred to as one of Arthur's chamberlains, serving Arthur as a high-ranking court official, but not described as a prince, but presented as a court official. So the idea that a prince cannot be described as a court official isn't the case. Princes apparently did serve as court officials. So especially when we consider the fact that the life of St. Samson was not describing Anna's father separately to Ammon's father, but rather it uses this expression to sum up both of their statuses, the status of both Anna's father and Ammon's father together. It makes sense that it refers to them as high-ranking court officials, because that's the best term to sum up both of their positions. So although there's no early confirmation that Anna was the daughter of Meirig of Gwent, that's the tradition that we have, and it's consistent with early tradition. There's no active reason to think it's not true, and there's no alternative tradition to replace it. So that matches what Geoffrey wrote about King Arthur having a sister called Anna. Now another example, which isn't as famous but it's more direct, is the example of Arthur's maternal uncle. So in Cilwch and Olwen, it describes how Arthur had a maternal uncle, the brother of his mother, called Gruffudd. I hope I've pronounced that kind of right at least, but it's a difficult name to say. But anyway, you can see it there. He is supposedly the maternal uncle of Arthur. Now, this is a very rare name. In fact, it seems like the only other place that it appears, apart from one reference in a poem, which is interesting in its own right, and we'll have a look at that another time. But the only other major instance where this occurs is in the Book of Llandaff. In the Book of Llandaff, we find a clear reference to a king with this name ruling as the king of Urging. Now, Urging was the kingdom of Athrwys' maternal grandfather, Gurgunvaur, and this king, Gruffudd, appears after the start of the reign of Gurgunvaur in the Book of Llandaff. Now, unfortunately, the Book of Llandaff doesn't say who he was. It doesn't say who he was the son of, but given the chronology and the fact that he's presented as the king of Urging, it makes sense that he's one of Gurgunvaur's sons. There are many examples of charters which don't mention the parentage of the kings who gave the land grants, so this isn't unusual. But the fact is, based on his position, based on the chronology, it makes the most sense that he was the son of the previous king, which was Gurgunvaur. So if that's the case, and it's by far the most logical conclusion, then that would mean that he was indeed the maternal uncle of Athrwys, exactly like this character with the same name is said to have been in Cilwch and Olwen. Now another example is David. The famous Saint David of Wales, according to Geoffrey of Monmouth, was the uncle of King Arthur, and again he's said to have been the maternal uncle of Arthur. Now it's interesting that there's no medieval genealogy which offers any kind of explanation for this. But when we look to the Book of Llandaff, we find some very interesting information. Again, the Book of Llandaff is very, very useful. So in the Book of Llandaff, we find that there's a witness who appears in the witness lists with the name Dewi. So this name, Dewi, is a common variant of the name David seen in records about the famous Saint David of Wales. And notably, in the Book of Llandaff, we find that this figure, Dewi, appears on the side of the clergy. So he fits the position of David, he fits the name of David, and he fits the chronology of David. And it's also interesting that he's specifically called the head priest. This is a unique designation in the Book of Llandaff. There is no other figure in any of the witness lists who's called the head priest. So that suggests there was something very, very important about this specific Dewi, or David. So he lived at the same time. He was active in the same area, by the way. I forgot to mention that. David was principally active in South Wales. The same time, same place, same name, same position as a member of the clergy, and an extremely important figure as well among the clergy. So that all matches David. What's interesting, though, is that the genealogy that's commonly assigned to David, the famous Saint David of Wales, is often viewed by scholars as an obvious fiction. His parents seem to be called Saint and Nun, which do seem to be fictitious names. And also the number of generations between him and King Athrwys, his ancestor, is too short to be reasonable, given when David lived and when King Athrwys lived. So it seems that the genealogy that's normally assigned to him isn't genuine, it's not valid, it's deficient. So the fact that here in the Book of Llandaff he's called the son of Kirken isn't an issue, just because that conflicts with the common lineage given to David of Wales, because the common lineage appears to be fictitious. So what's interesting is that Kirken, as I explained in a previous video, would appear to be an alternative spelling of the name Gurgen, as in Gurgenvawr. So given that the chronology matches and the place matches, this specifically is in Erging, not just South East Wales in general, but specifically the Kingdom of Erging. Everything indicates that this could well have been a son of Gurgenvawr. There's no other Gurgen who appears in the genealogical records at that time who could be this Kirken, the father of this Dewi. So, as I explained in more detail in my other video, this is strong evidence that David really was the maternal uncle of Athrwys, in that he really was the son of Gurgenvawr from Erging. Now, another example, in the life of Saint Eflem, Eflem is said to have been the cousin of King Arthur, and Eflem was the son of an unnamed Irish king. However, when we take the sum total of everything that we know from Eflem and his parentage from the available traditions, we see that he was allegedly the son of an Irish king, unnamed, but in Britain, in specifically South Wales, and this king fought against another Irish king in Britain, and this all occurred around about the turn of the 6th century. But these two kings, Eflem's father and this other unnamed Irish king in Britain, they eventually made peace, and Eflem's father sent his son Eflem to the kingdom of his former enemy, and Eflem married the daughter of that king. So that all happened towards around the turn of the 6th century. The only figures who match those descriptions is Anlach, the father of Brychan, who was an Irish king in South Wales, in Brycheiniog, and he is recorded as having a war with a king from Powys, who, according to other evidence, would appear to have been an Irish king. And at the end of that war, they made peace, and then Anlach's son, Brychan, went over to that kingdom and had relations with the daughter of that king. So this is, by a long way, the best match, the only decent match, actually, for Eflem's father. There's no other king in Britain, an Irish king in Britain in South Wales, around about 500, who matches this. There's no other option for him. So this evidence, in my opinion, strongly supports the identification of Anlach as the father of Eflem. In other words, Brychan and Eflem were brothers. So Brychan going over to Powys to have relations with the daughter of the king, and and Eflem being sent over to marry the king's daughter, they were related events. It was all part of the same situation. So the point is, Anlach was apparently the father of Eflem. There's no other decent candidate for him. Now, the reason why this is so significant is because Brican was the first cousin of Athrwys. So if Eflem was also a son of Anlach, if he was a brother of Brican, then he would also naturally have been a first cousin of Athrwys. And since Arthur and Eflem were said to have been cousins, that's a very good match. Another example of a cousin of Arthur, who can probably be identified with a cousin of Athrwys, is Illtyd. So Illtyd was a prominent religious figure in the 6th century, and in his life, he's described as the son of a certain Bicanus of Llador. Llador being another name for Brittany. However, there's good evidence that in some context, it was actually a reference to a region in Brycheiniog. And in this particular context, that seems to especially be the case. Scholars have made convincing arguments that the Llador in the life of St. Illtyd specifically is a region in Brycheiniog, southeast Wales. So when we look at what we know about Brycheiniog in the era in which Illtyd was said to have been born, around the beginning of the 6th century, can we identify Bicanus? Well, it seems to me very probable that he can be identified as Brican. Bicanus, to me, seems to be just a very slight corruption of the name Brican with the Latin US on the end. There are many, many examples, just to be clear, many examples of consonant clusters at the beginning of names being reduced to just a single consonant. So it's not strange to see the BR reduced to just a B. This kind of corruption happened all the time. So it would be very easy for Brican to be changed and corrupted into Bicanus. And unless he was just an unrecorded prince from that region, Brican is really the only option, the only possible candidate for who he could be. Now, admittedly, that's speculation, but if we accept it, and I think it seems reasonable, then that would mean that Illtyd would be the first cousin once removed of Athrwys. So that fits what the life of St. Illtyd says about him being the cousin of Athrwys. There are other examples where cousin is explicitly used in contexts which make it clear that it means at least first cousin once removed, if not more times removed. So this isn't unusual. So the fact that this would make Illtyd a first cousin once removed of Athrwys rather than just a first cousin isn't a valid objection in my opinion. So let's now take a look at some sons of Arthur. In a previous video, fairly recently actually, I looked at the case of Gwydri. So he appears as a son of Arthur in the tale Cilwch and Olwen, and there's good evidence that he can be identified with a certain Gurhtr, who appears in the Book of Llandaff as an heir of the kingdom of Athrwys. It's ambiguous whether this particular Gurhtr is actually the heir of Morgan, Athrwys' son, or the heir of Athrwys himself. So you can go and see the video for the full case about that. But even if he can't quite be identified as the actual son of Athrwys, it clearly shows that this name was used by this same dynasty in that very period. And this name can be shown to be an alternative form of the name of Arthur's son in the legend. Like I said, go see my previous video for the full case about it. But there are two other sons of Arthur from the legends who can be identified as sons of Athrwys. So in a certain French record from 1209, we find a reference to King Arthur having three sons. One of them was Morgan the Black, the other one was Patrick the Red, and the other one was Adolf the Third. Now, Patrick doesn't match anyone who appears in the dynasty of Athrwys, but I think Morgan and Adolf can be identified as the historical sons of Athrwys. So regarding Morgan, well, Athrwys had a son called Morgan. That's very straightforward. And what's particularly interesting is that in this record, Arthur's son Morgan is specifically said to have lived in South Wales, and he ruled over Wales as a whole. So that matches, obviously in exaggerated form, that matches Morgan, the son of Athrwys. He didn't rule over all of Wales, obviously, but he was a king who ruled in South Wales. So that matches the description of Morgan in this French record. And as for Adolf, well, that, I believe, can be explained as a corruption of Aethel, especially when we look at the other spellings of this name with a D in the place of the T. This seems like just a corruption of the name Aethel. So we have Morgan and we have Adolaf, and they match the historical Morgan and Aethel, the sons of Athrwys. Now there are at least 3 more examples of family members of Athrwys who match family members of King Arthur, but they require a little bit more explanation, and I don't want to rush this. And I see this video is already, well, it's 37 minutes for me. I don't know what the final cut will be, but anyway, so I'm going to stop now, and then in the future video, well, in a week, we'll see the rest of these family members, the other 3 at least. But for now, let me leave you with a question for my next video, before the one about King Arthur. What's the truth about this whole thing about Atlas, the king of Mauritania, and how he supposedly matches Atlas, the king of Atlantis? Does that really check out? Well, let's see next time in my next video.